So thanks, Julia, for that introduction. And thank you also for coming and watching this virtual talk. I just want to give you a little warning that I'm going to show some images of human remains later on in the talk. It'll be towards the end, but I will give a warning because I know some people are a bit sensitive to that. I would say they're not gruesome; they're skeletal human remains. So, but as I say, I'll give a warning. So, for those of you that don't know, I thought I would just tell you exactly, or show you exactly where Kilmartin is in relation to the rest of the west coast of Scotland. And there's a handy Glasgow relation on the map there, which will hopefully help you to locate yourself. So the extraordinary palimpsest of archaeological sites and monuments and the rich artefact assemblages that are found in and around Kilmartin Glen form one of Scotland's most important archaeological landscapes. It's stories of international importance, and they have relevance for the overall development of Scotland as a nation. There are more than 800 prehistoric sites and monuments of many different forms and many different time periods recorded within around about a 6-mile radius of Kilmartin. It's probably a little bit wider than that. And more of sites are being discovered all the time. So what I'd like to focus on is really the most extraordinary period of Kilmartin's prehistory and history, which is the Neolithic and Bronze Age, where we see Kilmartin developing into a funerary and ritual centre of a similar scale to importance to Orkney, to Stonehenge, and also the Boyne Valley in Ireland. I'm going to focus on the stories that our collection reveals about this time period in Kilmartin. So, as Julia says, we have about 20,000 would be far too many, 20,000 artefacts in the collection at the moment. And when the museum was founded in 1992, really, we only had an absolute handful. So we've grown these collections via the treasure trove system in Scotland, which is under which everyone has to collect archaeological objects. And in 2019, just over 11,000, which comprise the prehistoric collection, were recognised as being nationally significant by Museums Galleries Scotland. So we're the 50th such collection in Scotland, but of recognised collections, but we're actually one of just a handful that have been recognised for having significant archaeology in our collections. So these amazing artefacts, I'll show you some in a minute, were really the reason we embarked on the redevelopment project. So as Julia says, it's over £7 million project now to build a new museum. And this is a schematic of what it will look like. And it will hopefully, all being well, open in the spring of 2023. And in it, we will have an exhibition which will tell the exciting story of some of the artefacts that I'm going to feature today. But we'll also have a fit-for-purpose collection store, which is something we've been lacking at the museum for many, many years. And I should say, just as a slight aside, we're still fundraising, so there are chances to have a named plaque if you would so wish. And obviously, you can contact the team in the same way that you contacted to book into the talk. So enough of the hard sell. I'll get back to artefacts, which are the heart of the museum. But actually, the most important thing that these things do really is to tell us something about the lives of people living in Kilmartin Glen in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So we should never forget archaeology is essentially all about people. And the team are working on teasing out these stories in a way that we've never really had an opportunity to do. And so much of what I'm going to talk about has come about during conversations with Aaron Watson, who I know is here tonight, as well as others, and on doing research, looking at other people's research and the emerging knowledge that this is providing. But one of the things that we know is that all of the stories have commonalities about how important Kilmartin was during this period, but also about how connected it was to other places. So I should also say thanks to Erin for many of the images you're going to see today. So around 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago, cereals were introduced to Britain. And this and some other cultural changes herald a massive period of change and transition in the way that people all across Scotland live their lives, or across Britain, as they move from hunting and gathering to a settled, sedentary farming way of life. And this transition really is the most profound transition that humans have ever undergone. In Britain, they'd lived like this for at least 7,000 years after the last ice age. So although they were farming, they still made arrowheads such as this one, which kind of indicates to us they were probably hunting still for meat in the forests. And this one is one of our treasures. It's a really beautiful flint arrowhead. It's quite small, about the kind of half the size of one of your kind of finger joints. And it was found by Marion Campbell, who was a local antiquarian near Kilberry. And just to show you that this picture, which is replica arrowheads, and I wanted to just show you this to show you how these things would have been hafted. And obviously the wooden haft, the bindings, which would have been made from either fibre, cordage, or animal sinew or gut, and then pitch made with, here it's birch bark, boiled down birch bark resin, and they would have had feathers to flights on the end of them. So these things just don't survive, or very rarely survive in the archaeological record. But obviously these would have been, they're composite artefacts. So the farming way of life slowly spread across Britain, and there isn't time this evening to go into the debates about that. But at the end, I will give you some more resources if you're interested in that, to go and find out more. But one of the things we have in the area is very early evidence of cereal production, which comes from Camickle Glen. And those of you that will know the area knows this is one of the glens that intersects with Kilmartin. And this is Tulflaren Farm and the Tulflaren Rock Art site, which I'm going to come back to. And the work here that was undertaken by Southampton University detected very early cereal grain, and that was Professor Richard Tipping from Stirling University, at around 3,600 BC. So it's actually extraordinary evidence, because it's some of the one of the earliest dates for cereal production in the whole of Britain. But it also shows some early signs of the significance of the archaeology of the area. So as well as new plants that are brought into Britain, archaeologists also detect new tools and technologies being used at this time that we call Neolithic. And one of the tools that we find relatively frequently is, this is a completely new, innovative tool at that time, is what we now call a groundstone axe. And they are found almost universally across Europe. They would have been made by napping napping flint to create a rough out or stone, as the previous one was an example of stone. And this is what a rough out would have looked like. And then there would have been hours of polishing to produce a nice smooth surface with a very sharp cutting edge. And these are two artifacts from our collections that are groundstone axes, both of which were found on the shore at Castle Sween. So Castle Sween, for those of you that don't know, is a peninsula not that far away from here. So What did Neolithic people use grindstone axes for? What's the purpose of them? Is well, I guess the clue is in the name. To some extent, axes would have been used for cutting down trees, for woodworking, for butchering animals, and no doubt a host of other practical uses. And there is no doubt that people living in Kilmartin Glen would have needed tools to perform these tasks. But there's also something else going on with these axes. So the first thing is that the geology of the stone they're made from has been identified as porcelainite, which comes from Northern Ireland. So here's our peninsula roughly here, and obviously you'll be able to tell which bit of Ireland is Northern Ireland. So what's that doing in Scotland? The next clue, of course, is the place that they were found. So this is Castle Sween, and we're not sure of the exact find spot, but it was on the shore, somewhere on the beach at Castle Sween. The two of them, sorry. So was this an accidental loss? Was someone bringing a bag of axes over from across the sea from Ireland? I mean, what a journey that would have been in essentially skin currachs. Although you can see Northern Ireland from Scotland, it nonetheless it takes some guts to do that journey. So archaeologists have done a huge amount of work of identifying stone types for axes, the distribution of certain types of stone from certain axe quarries that are identified as being Neolithic. And they've discovered that people are not always choosing to make make axes from local stone, which in many cases would have been perfectly serviceable for practical purposes. And they do that, but they are also deliberately acquiring stone axes from materials that were sourced from faraway geographical locations. Stone axes from the Langdale axe quarries, for example, have been found in archaeological contexts far, far from Cumbria. And this is also the case with porcelainite from Ireland. So you can see from the images that porcelainite, like many of these other special stones, if you want to call it that, has aesthetic qualities. And it's probably part of the reason why people chose that stone to make axes, and probably possibly also partly why people wanted to acquire an axe made from such a lovely material. But again, we don't think that's the whole of the story. So this is the slide of the Langdale axe quarries, kindly provided by Erin. And as you can see, it's a really dramatic location. And the quarries are in places that are quite hard to reach, or you need to put in some effort to do that. They're also slightly dangerous, slightly scary, liminal places, which again is a recurring kind of theme that we see in the Neolithic. And also going back to our porcelainite axe, that the places that we find them deposited are also leading archaeologists to assume that these artefacts had a place in Neolithic people's spiritual beliefs and ritual practices. So for our axes, was this really an accidental loss? Or could they have been deliberately placed facing the ocean across which they'd travelled, a journey in itself which is fraught with danger? But we'll leave that one there for a moment, because we're certain that Neolithic people had a very different understanding of the world than we do. And they are the first people to construct monuments, to use Richard Bradley's, who's a very eminent and very exciting archaeologist, term, to alter the earth. This that I'm showing you here now is a plan of the Upper Largy quarry site with an image of, which is quite out of date now. There's less land, more quarry here now, which is literally a stone's throw from the museum. And Upper Largy has been excavated in advance of gravel quarrying at varying phases, and every time something extraordinary or many extraordinary discoveries are made. But this discovery here, if you can see, the plan has been adapted as work has gone on, but this is the only version I have. One of the earliest monuments that we know of in Kilmartin Glen is the Upper Largy Cursus monument, and this is an extraordinary monument. Actually, it is a line of wooden posts which were arranged, or two lines of wooden posts, in two lines that were about 400 meters long, and it's been carbon dated to 3,800 to 3,650 BC. So the construction of the cursus would have involved chopping down mature oak trees. Probably, well, it would have been with stone axes, but maybe not our porcelainite one. And so the person who last held that porcelainite axe before it ended up in the sea at Castle Sween would have known about this place for certain. So archaeologists understand cursus monuments to be places where rituals and ceremonies would have taken place, possibly connected to ancestor veneration, or some people suggest initiation. So you're talking about a group of people here that was beginning to settle in one place. They were investing in one place. So ritual and ceremonies and the physical manifestations of those are all important elements in a kind of placemaking, if you like, a kind of community glue that humans kind of need. So this spectacular image, which is an image of the cursus reconstructed by Aaron and then burned by Aaron, is just to show you that we know that the cursus monument was burned, as other cursus monuments were. Which, again, if this had taken place at night, can you imagine the spectacle? Would have been almost certainly performed as part of a ceremony, might have involved sound, music, smoke, fire, and almost certainly ritual specialists. And the cursus sits on a terrace at the north end of Kilmartin Glen. So this would have been able to be seen from many, many locations. And the terrace itself is almost like a kind of theatrical stage, as it were, which so many places in Kilmartin are, because of the geology, and they have been utilised and used to enhance monuments by people in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. I should say there is now nothing left of this cursus, and when it was excavated, it was literally it was not known about until soil stripping took the topsoil off. But it's what archaeologists call preserved by record now. And if anyone wants to read the full report on the Upper Largy Quarry site, it is available. So other places of ceremony in Kilmartin that relate to the Neolithic period are at Temple Wood. Temple Wood stone circles have their origin in the Neolithic. It's a very complicated site, but we think that excavated by Jack Scott in the 1960s and 70s, latterly. There was first a timber circle, the northeast circle, and then this was would have been, we think, replaced by a stone circle. There's also in Kilmartin, we begin also to see glimpses in the different way of understanding the world, in the way that Neolithic people treated their dead. They constructed tombs which were used for communal burial, and this is Netherlargy South chambered cairn, which has been dated to around about 3,700 BC. It was excavated quite early on in Kilmartin's kind of history by antiquarians, and the dating comes from pottery stars that were found inside the cairn. And of course, its original trapezoid form has been altered by later Bronze Age peoples. So it appears today much rounder, and also it's been prepared so that it can be visited by people. So it would never have looked quite like this in prehistory. There are at least 5 chambered cairns in and around Kilmartin Glen, but this one is the largest and the most elaborate. We know from excavations of this site and many other chambered cairns that the bodies that were placed inside were almost certainly put inside as skeletons or even partial skeletons. So there's suggestions of excarnation, or the rotting of flesh happens outside the cairns. And people were accompanied on occasion by grave goods. So the 1864 excavation of this site does record quite a lot of human remains found, but sadly these did not find their way into any museum, and it's not recorded in the reports what happened to them, but I suspect that they were reburied, and probably reburied in Kilmartin graveyard, actually. It was a minister who dug this site, excavated it in 1864. One of the things we do have, though, is some of the pottery that came from this site. Now, strictly speaking, this is not one of our treasures. It's actually a treasure of another museum, but I couldn't resist showing it to you. This is also demonstrating that in the Neolithic, people had a knowledge of how to make pottery, and it is very rare to find a complete Neolithic pot. This one, it has been reconstructed, but nonetheless, all the sherds are present. And as you can see, it's a round base pot, which is a particular Neolithic style. And when Erin and I were decanting the museum exhibition to move everything into temporary accommodation, and we were doing the condition reports on this particular pot because of the pandemic, the curators from the British Museum weren't able to come up. We actually noticed, it doesn't show very well on this slide, that it is actually in fact decorated very faintly with lines that converge. You can just see some of them just there, but it is an incredibly beautiful pot. And these would have been placed into the grave as a grave good for the deceased to take into the afterlife. And again, this idea of ancestor veneration, or creating mythical ancestors, and the creation of chambered cairns is all part of this kind of thing that we're starting to see in the Neolithic about place making and the importance of place. So moving on into the later Neolithic period, one of the major components of our recognised collection is around about 10,000 pieces of smashed up quartz, which you can see some of them here as they were found on in situ. And you might say, well, what's the point in a museum keeping all this stuff? Is it really treasure? Well, to us, it most definitely is, and it's hugely significant because it comes from one of the few excavations of a rock art site that have been undertaken, and this is the rock that I showed you earlier at Tulflaren, which has rock art on it, and it's part of the part of the project from Southampton University to excavate rock art. And I'll come back to this in just a minute, but just to show you, Ludwig, I can see some people here like Margaret and Wilrud and Erin, and many other people, I'm sure, are absolutely fully cognizant of the fact that Kilmartin Glen has an amazing density of rock art sites in and around it, and it's one of the densest areas of activity for rock art in the whole British Isles. And this is a map Matt Ritchie and the Forestry Commission allowed us to use this from a recent publication that we were part of, to show the rock art sites and the cut mark kiss slabs and cut mark stones in and around Kilmartin Glen. It's a huge density. And it's a particular kind of rock art known as Atlantic rock art, which has a motif palette that includes cups with rings and lines and grooves and one or two other motifs. This rock art tradition is broadly distributed along across northern and western Britain, down the Atlantic seaboard into France, Spain, and Portugal. And this is the rock art site at Achnabrec, which is the largest cup and ring mark site. You can see this ginormous cup and ring mark here. And also Ormeg, which is a rock art site that's actually not that far away from where I'm sitting right now, which is again a hugely important rock art site, which as part of the Southampton project, we worked with them to excavate this rock art site. And you can see over here Davina and myself excavating a rock art site that's had a tree planted on top of it. And as a result of that, we do have some rock art in our collection because the tree roots had got alongside some of the cracks and natural cracks and fissures in the rock and prized off the rocks themselves. So this is how we ended up having some cup and ring marks in our recognised collection. So what do we know about rock art? Well, up until fairly recently, it had kind of been ignored as a prehistoric monument type. And actually, the work at Torflaren is still one of the very few. It remains as one of the few rock art sites in Britain to be excavated. But Richard Bradley and Aaron Watson and some other people are doing more work, which is adding to the emerging understanding of these sites. And at Torflaren, the carbon dates helped us to place it in the late Neolithic, although there is a lot more work to do on that. So that's just carbon dates from just one site. We do need to, although, yeah, I think there's other carbon dates coming from other sites, which probably are corroborating that. But we know that they are located at significant points in the landscape. We know that the people who made this rock art had a profoundly heightened sense of place, of spirituality, and that the carving and using of these sites probably involved ancestor or spirit veneration. They might have been seen as portals or liminal places, places where the veil between them and the underworld or the other worlds was thin. And we know this when we look at ethnographic accounts of or talk to people who still have a long-standing tradition of making rock art, some of these kind of ideas are emerging and seem to hold resonance with the rock art we see in Scotland. Their making and use in prehistory might have involved ceremonies that were designed to take account of the movement of the sun and moon at different times of the year. Or if any of you saw Aaron's winter talk last month, he talked about Achnabrec and illuminating the sun, setting sun, illuminating certain motifs at that site. You can, I think Aaron's talk is going to be available online, but also Aaron did a talk for the Scotland's Rock Art Project, which is also available online. And also the work at Torflaren demonstrated that the rock art site we see today might not all, be all that was once there, that possibly ceremonies or rituals which took place at the site might have involved the creation of the sites, but also the smashing of quartz, because the 10,000 bits of quartz were found scattered around the rock art sites. And if you smash quartz in the dark. It has a glow, which is known as tribothermoluminescence. And of course, also it creates an awful lot of sparkly dust. So we must regard our 10,000 bits of smashed quartz as really important cultural artifacts that were made and used by Neolithic people living in the area. But also the careful study of some of these reveals that some of them were probably hammerstones that were used to make rock art. And these are some of them listed here. So really incredible insights coming from that excavation. So by the time metal and the knowledge of metalworking arrives in Britain, Kilmartin Glen is already a place of significance, and it's almost certainly known about elsewhere as a ritual centre. The very early period of metal use in Britain is sometimes described as the Chalcolithic period, after copper. So we have Neolithic, Chalcolithic, then Bronze Age, and the Chalcolithic is a very short period of about 300 years where copper and gold were in use before bronze. So the next, if I might like to call them wee stories, I want to tell you is about the extraordinary discovery, again, at Archaeology quarry site, of a burial. This discovery was made by AOC Archaeology in, I think it was 2005, but I can't really overemphasize the significance of this discovery. So this pot, as you see in situ here, which is broken and there, was found in a grave. So there were 3 of them in total. This is just one. We're working our way through photographing the others, but I should say we need to reconstruct them before we can do that properly. Along with 2 flints. No human remains survived, unfortunately, but we know it was a grave by comparison with other sites. So human remains don't often survive in the soils in Kilmartin, which is a huge shame, because we can get so much information about how people in prehistory lived with them. So this is one of the other pots. And this is the pot of the, a picture of the pot you saw in situ, reconstructed. So it's a kind of pot known as a beaker, and many of you might have heard of beaker pots. They are a very specific form of pottery vessel, made very finely made of coils of clay, which have been built up. People didn't know how to make wheel-made pottery at this time. They've been then shaped and smoothed and decorated. This particular one has been decorated with a all-over corded pot, is known as an AOC. Slightly confusing because AOC Archaeology excavated it, and it's a 2-ply twisted cord has been used to press into the beaker to create the design. And actually, we know how long the cord was as well, because you can see the bits where it was stopped and then started again. So archaeologists understand beaker culture. You will have potentially, if you've heard of beakers, you will have heard of the beaker people or beaker culture as not being related to a particular pottery type, but to a complex cultural, ideological, and social phenomena, which involve metalwork, firstly gold and copper, and then later on bronze, and specific types of orientation expressed in grave goods, gender-specific rules regarding burial, and these all indicate a shared ideology, shared culture, and beliefs. And the beaker phenomena really does represent an amazing period of cultural contacts in Western and Central Europe. they're found in graves, placed there to serve as grave goods, again for the deceased to take into the afterlife, whatever that was. And they are also found in other contexts, but generally in the form of sherds rather than whole pots. We have other beaker pottery from Kilmartin Glen. This one here is from the National Museum of Scotland. This one was found at Rudel. We have this beaker pot that belongs to the British Museum now, was found in Netherlargy South. And this one is upside down because the base is missing. Is a beaker pot that was found in Ballyminoch. Just go back to this one. Our upper Largy beaker then. So what makes the upper Largy beaker pots in the grave so extraordinary is that the carbon dates by AOC came back 2,560 to 2,290 BC, which is one of the earliest dates for a beaker grave in the whole of Britain. And when Alison Sheridan from the National Museum, who really is the beaker pottery expert, as well as many other things in Scotland, looked at these pots and actually did the reconstruction as well, she determined them to be of a particular kind of beaker made and used in the Netherlands. The flint tools that were in the grave were made from Irish flint, we think. So what does this tell us about the person buried in the grave? Well, they were extraordinary and exceptional, I think we have to say to start with. And it's generally accepted that this form of pottery is used to signify status, but it also might have had other associations around the establishment of myths and of the creation of ancestors. But we can say that the person buried there would have been of high status within their community, but were the people living in Kilmartin at the time actually their community? So we know that a recent Beaker People project, which has done an extraordinary amount of work looking at individuals buried in early Beaker graves right the way across Britain and Ireland. They've used DNA and other scientific techniques, and they've established a number of individuals that have come from the continent. Although we don't have the human remains for this particular grave, it seems very likely that the person buried in this grave had also come from the continent, and that he or she was probably not travelling alone, because the particular style of grave is also thought to be continental as well. And I should say, on balance of probability, they were probably male, because most but not all of the early Beaker immigrants were male. So the link to beakers and the introduction of copper, other metalwork to Britain, does make it tempting to suggest that this group of people might have come to the already established ritual centre at Kilmartin, and they may have been looking for sources of copper. And this is a lump of copper, and there are sources of copper in Kilmartin. This is a slide or a couple of images to show you of an 18th century copper mine, which again is about 5 or 10 minutes walk away from where I'm sitting right now. It's near Kilmartin, just over the hill. And this is the shaft here. The shaft is just about there. I would say this is a winter bat roost. So those of you that are in Kilmartin, don't be tempted to go in there because you'll disturb the bats. But also, it's really scary and quite dangerous. There's dirty great hole that drops straight down if you go so far into this shaft. And there is some tentative evidence of prehistoric mining in this copper seam. So the knowledge of how to transform what really are rather unassuming lumps of rock into shiny, sharp, dangerous, but also fabulous tools, we think would almost certainly have been regarded as magical. And if your source of copper was from a sacred place as well, it's not just about the economics of obtaining copper, potentially. Beakers also are used, we know, from lipid evidence, lipids of fats, which leave traces on the inside of pottery. Beakers sometimes been evidence of the use of alcohol has been found in these, but also traces of other liquids. And one of our beakers from Archaeology, dairy fat was detected. This could have been that milk was placed in the beaker before it was placed in the grave, but also potters will tell you that sometimes milk is used to seal a pot to make it more waterproof because it's fat. And Julia's nodding because she's a potter as well. So going back to the individual and that group of people that might have come, did they stay or did they go back to the Netherlands? Well, we don't know actually the answer to that, but I think the evidence, certainly the person who was buried didn't go back, but some other people in the group might have done, one imagines. But we think certainly some of these early immigrants would have stayed because the beaker phenomena is incorporated into the culture of every area where it appears. And each area takes it on, but gives it a unique spin. And we certainly see that in Kilmartin. A few generations later, temple wood is used. The outside of temple wood is used as for a beaker burial. But of the actual metalwork itself, we find very little in Kilmartin. What we do have is an axe here which has a very high copper content in it, and it is an early axe, was found in Tainault by a metal detector, and that's one of the few bronze or copper artifacts that we have. So beakers certainly are part of the continued development of Kilmartin Glen as a ritual centre in the early Bronze Age. And this is really a period where Kilmartin shines out as an extraordinary place. We see the emergence of an elite, essentially, who are expressing status and identity through building massive burial cairns, and they also have really wide-ranging contacts and connections. So this is the linear cemetery, which is just incredible in many counts. And also Templewood has adaptations at this time. And the North Circle, Stone Circle, was probably dismantled around about then, and its stones may be deployed in kists elsewhere. And there are over 70 Bronze Age burial cairns locally, and that includes the linear cemetery. So this photograph shows the linear cemetery going up the glen. It's an extraordinary monument. It extends for nearly 2 kilometres. It consists today of 5 cairns, but there may have been more. And as I mentioned, the pre-existing chambered cairn here was modified and incorporated. Again, potentially the builders were trying to identify with earlier mythical ancestors, but certainly they were using this to emphasise their power and status, and certainly of the people who were buried here. Some of the other things related to metal and copper are This is a grave slab, the kist slab. Would have been facing the dead from Netherlargy north, and it is a cut-marked stone that's almost certainly been quarried away from a rock outside, and then these copper flat axe shapes have been overlain onto this stone. And there's also some at Raikruin. They are extraordinary, and the only other place that we know of at the moment that has these axe markings is on the monoliths at Stonehenge. And this is a laser scan at the top of these axes. They were not known about until fairly recently, although people had suggested there might have been axe markings, but the laser scanning really did bring them out. They are of a different type of axe than the type of axes we find in Kilmartin. And there's also around about this time, we think that the spiral design on one of the stones at Templewood was extended. Many of you will have visited Templewood and not been able to see this spiral, and we owe this photograph to Aaron. It is which highlights the spiral really, really well. And this is a kind of art that we know as megalithic art because it's on monuments. And Kilmartin Glen is one of the only places where you find Atlantic rock art and megalithic art together. This is also another extraordinary thing, which pot that speaks of connections with Kilmartin. So this is the Upper Largy footed food vessel. It's fabulous little pot. It's completely unique to Scotland. So the body of it is Irish in style, and it has the four little feet are a Yorkshire trait. So again, you think about who made this pot. Did they see pottery in Yorkshire? Did they visit Ireland? Did they go to both these places? Was it a combination of more than one person's idea? Certainly would have been made by a specialist potter. We're pretty sure they existed at the time. Again, it was placed in a grave, and again, we don't have the human remains. Although the grave is thought to have consisted of a wooden kist. But again, it's materials and ideas gathered together and represented in Kilmartin, and this happens in other burials too. This is a jet necklace, a fabulous jet necklace, spacer plate jet necklace from which is in the National Museum collections, from a kist that was found on the Patalic estate, and jet is Yorkshire, comes from Yorkshire. So this and it was probably made in Yorkshire, and it ended up in a grave in Kilmartin. Another fragments of a spacer plate necklace were found in the Glebe Cairn, which is the northernmost in the linear cemetery, but we don't have those any. They didn't. That was 1860, and they haven't survived to come into a museum. So other treasures in our collection again are this other examples of pottery from graves. Is this lovely pot that was excavated from a kist at Canassery Farm, which the museum excavated not that long ago. A kist was discovered on a very prominent knoll on the farm, which is above in the hills above the top, looking down over Kilmartin. And again, this is the kist here. Human remains again hadn't survived. And this pot was all that remained of the burial deposit. But it required a substantial amount of conservation, which was kindly funded by anonymous donors. They know who they are, so thank you. We say thank you to them once again. So I'm just going to tell you a couple more stories and then I'll wrap up. I realise it's 8 o'clock. We did start a little bit late. And now I just give my warning that we're coming up to human remains now. So there are some very rare survivals of human remains in the area. And in about the year 2000, a burial in a rock shelter near Ford, which is just around the corner to the north of Kilmartin, was disturbed and subsequently excavated. And you can see that little line there is the pot in the rock shelter from the excavation report. The burial consisted of cremated human remains, and these are them. The individual had been placed inside the pot, which was very fragmentary. Here's a bit of it here. But analysis determined that the person in the pot, buried in the pot, was aged between 25 and 40, and he was a male. He'd suffered from a mild iron deficiency anemia, but the analysis suggested that it didn't affect his general health. He was cremated with a young sheep or goat, and the remains of this were also placed in the pot. And you can see just there is a flint tool, which was unburned, which was also placed in the pot. The pot's very fragmentary and very damaged, but we know it as an enlarged food vessel urn, is what archaeologists call it. And another grave from the area, again, Archaeology, contains an inhumation. And this was somebody buried in a kist, a stone lined grave, essentially. She was a woman, so at the moment we're referring to her as the Archaeology woman. And her grave had been disturbed at some point in the past, but it's assumed that she was buried in a crouch position. When we got the human remains handed to us with the other material from Archaeology through the treasure trove system, we're not quite sure what happened to her, but it looks like someone has tried to do a very bad facial reconstruction, and they've used really inappropriate materials. So there's sellotape, there's blue tack, cotton wool. We were obviously needed to do something about this, so we went and raised £6,000 to do some serious conservation work, and the Pilgrim Trust kindly funded that. This is Will Murray from the Scottish Conservation Studio holding the skeleton, the skull, after the conservation work had been done. The skull had been damaged by the blue tack, the sellotape, and the cotton wool, but he and an osteologist did an amazing job of reconstructing her. And she actually had some sherds of beaker pottery placed in the fill of her grave, as well as some flint artefacts. And the charcoal, there was charcoal there which gave us a carbon date, which was Bronze Age. She's not as early as our Three Beakers burial. So what do we know about her life? Well, the osteologists were able to determine that she was probably in her 20s when she died. We don't know why she died. She did have some spinal joint disease, but this was unlikely to have caused her any pain or any problems with mobility. She had dental enamel hyperplasia, which is the presence of lines or grooves or pits on the surface of the tooth crown. And these occur when the crown formation is interrupted by periods of illness or malnutrition. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis of molar enamel revealed that she probably grew up in Scotland, probably locally. And we did make an attempt at extracting DNA, but unfortunately her skeleton is too degraded for any DNA to have survived. So we don't know if, for example, she's the descendant of immigrants, because some of the scientific analysis is telling you she definitely grew up in Scotland. But other beaker graves have been able to detect that people were the descendants of immigrants. Also, carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of her bone collagen determined that her diet was dominated by terrestrial resources. So this is despite the proximity of Kilmartin to the sea. And this is comparable with data for a similar time period elsewhere. Doesn't appear to have eaten in any significant amounts shellfish or marine mammals at any point during her life. But what do we think her life was like? So we know, as you hopefully will be able to have seen from this talk, that she lived in a society where some individuals had elevated status. And it's kind of tempting, I suppose, to say she probably wasn't one of them, because she didn't have a massive amount of grave goods. She didn't have a ginormous cairn placed over her grave. But she did have beaker pottery, which probably signals her out as being unusual, unless, of course, there were residual beaker sherds, which had found their way into the archaeological record through as her grave was filled in. My own thoughts on that is, I don't think people in prehistory place anything anywhere by accident. It's all things we find are significant. But one thing I'm fairly certain she did was probably walk down the line of the linear cemetery, and she would have had knowledge of who was buried there, and their stories would have been still alive. And she was part of the culture who elevated the importance of Kilmartin Glen to its height in prehistory. So I will finish there, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.